The military parade is really a kind of classic spectacle, propaganda to motivate, to mobilize adulation of the fascist leader, and also to demonstrate the military might that is at his disposal to effect his political aims.
We have genocidal ideology, and what are the key features of that? One aspect that's really important to keep in mind is kind of this cosmic enemy. The ones that they're focusing on, who they really see as enemies in some kind of essential way. These are immigrants, particularly undocumented ones, and trans people.
Welcome to episode 252 of the Refuse-Fascism podcast, a podcast brought to you by volunteers with Refuse-Fascism. This is Lena Thorne, one of those volunteers sitting in for Sam Goldman. Refuse-Fascism works to unite all who can be united to join in mass, nonviolent protest and resistance in the streets and throughout society, growing to include millions and refusing to stop until we create such a profound political crisis that Trump cannot impose his fascist program or even maintain his hold on power. Big thanks to our patrons, everyone who rates, reviews, shares the show, and reps our merch. Every bit helps connect more people with Refuse-Fascism. If you haven't yet, take a second to leave a review, share the show, or hit up our merch store. Today, we're sharing two interviews. First, you'll hear from journalist and essayist Judith Levine, who has the Substack Today in Fascism, and then we'll share an interview with Elisa von Joden-Forgy, co-founder and executive director of the Lemkin Institute for Genocide Prevention. On the day of Trump's fascist military parade, with military force being deployed in Los Angeles, and in defiance of the outright threat from Trump that any protest in Washington, D.C. would be met with, quote, very big force, unquote, over 1,000 people marched with Refuse-Fascism to the White House. The determination and conviction of the marchers broke a spell of fear of protesting in D.C. on the day of Trump's military parade. We salute everyone who joined in declaring, in the name of humanity, we refuse to accept a fascist America. Trump must go now, in front of the White House, and we encourage folks to check out our coverage on social media, on our website, and likely in next week's episode. Most of the crew was at the protest, so as you can imagine, we are a bit spent. So keeping today's remarks short because we have really powerful interviews for you as well. Shout out to the millions across the country at No King's Day protests. In over 2,000 locations across the country in big cities and small towns, people took to the streets to voice their righteous opposition to Trump's military parade. These protesters were nonviolent, but in LA, police unleashed tear gas, rubber bullets, and horses on the protesters. There was also a few more violent attacks against protesters, including a man driving an SUV into a crowd of protesters in Virginia and Riverside, California, and a shooting in Utah. Stay tuned to Refuse-Fascism for more details on how these outpourings across the country can be turned into the sort of sustained movement that can oust this fascist regime. Now, here is Sam's conversation with Judith Levine recorded on June 13th, which focuses on Trump's military parade and developments from the past week that demonstrate the regime's move to a new phase from what Judith calls soft authoritarianism to the government's war against the people.
This week, we are speaking with longtime journalist, essayist, author of 5 books, Judith Levine, as the Trump regime escalates its war on immigrants, dissent, and even basic civil governance. Over just the past several days, Trump has sent National Guard troops and now Marines into Los Angeles. Tens of thousands of immigrants are being rounded up without due process. Protesters are being brutalized in the streets. Democratic officials like California Senator Alex Padilla have been arrested. And in Washington, D.C., Trump is staging grotesque military displays demanding loyalty and submission, consolidating his fascist grip on power. Judith Levine is the author of Today in Fascism, a Substack, judithlevine.substack.com, that's become really essential reading for anyone who refuses to look away from what this regime is doing. She covers the actions of the Trump administration with clarity, moral urgency, and absolutely no sugarcoating, no downplaying in the name of comfort. And personally, I appreciate that so much.
And a little humor.
As she wrote the other day, more than 5 months into Trump's second term, we are entering a new phase, quote, violence, propaganda, surveillance, the fascist triumvirate. The military invasion of LA moves the Trump administration from soft authoritarianism to a new phase, the government's war against the people, end quote. And that is a war that's not just domestic. I think Judith would agree. This phase extends globally and it is brutal. So Judith, thank you for joining us. Welcome. Let's get into it.
Thank you for having me.
Let's talk about what's happening domestically first. By the time this episode is released, the military parade will have already happened with, I should mention, hopefully massive protests against Trump as the counterpoint around the country and in DC as well. But give us your synopsis of what Trump's June 14th military parade through DC represents and what he wants it to represent.
The military parade is really a kind of classic spectacle propaganda to motivate, to sort of mobilize adulation of the fascist leader and also to demonstrate the military might that is at his disposal, as he sees it, to affect his political aims and probably his financial aims as well. And every single authoritarian does the same thing. You see it in Russia, you see it in North Korea, you see it in China, you see Pinochet did it, and every authoritarian, of course, Hitler, Mussolini. It's a ritual of consent by the people who at least are there. And it is not, as you're suggesting, it's not just a message to the people in the United States, it's a message to everybody in the world. So, he's appropriating a historical and international, event, and he knows that. He's not making it up.
One of the things that struck me so much when I read your piece that you wrote for The Guardian was you're framing it as what he wants it to be, being this ceremonial birth of this 21st century fascist America. And I thought that, the way that you explained how we should understand this beyond the waste of money that it is, or beyond the ego trip that it is. Things can be more than one thing, but you're highlighting to us that we really need to view this in the context of a fascist advance, and that being really what he wants to show the world if we allow it. I just wanted to extend the appreciation for that because you did so in a way that I thought wasn't dismissive of the people who are raising the other issues, but was really helping us, for lack of a better words, keep our eye on the target here.
I wrote another piece that just came out in The Guardian that puts this thing in even a bigger context. And one of the things I said is that up until now, we've seen what I called soft authoritarianism. And that's the kind of attacks and punishments on the institutions of liberal democracy, such as the press, the arts, the universities, law firms, and also, of course, kind of the takeover of the administrative state. And of course, laced into that is real violence against real people's bodies, against pregnant people, against transgender people. But for the most part, this has been done, with the instruments of the government and his just by fiat. But now we have moved into a stage in which the state is doing violence, as you said in the beginning, declaring war on the citizens and residents of the United States. And that is a huge step. It's a huge step into, the perils that we can see ahead.
Thanks for highlighting that transformation. Given that, I wanted to ask a little bit about the moves that you see as important to recognize that Trump has already made in terms of transforming the military into a reflection of himself and the fascist future that he wants to bring into being.
I looked up this morning the expression "send in the Marines." I wanted to see what the origin of that was. And it turns out that the Marines were sent in 1921 because people were robbing mail trains. There was money. People used to send money through the mail. The government sent in the Marines. Hoover, I guess. It was interesting to me because I had always assumed that the Marines were not used for civil purposes. It sort of stopped. There was another wave of train robberies, and then the Marines were sent in again. But then, after that, we hadn't seen it. And I think since that time, there have been more laws passed that prohibit the use of the military, of the armed forces, for law enforcement within the United States against people and not waging war elsewhere. And I think also, the Marines are trained to do one thing, and that is kill. It's really the only thing they know how to do, and they do it very, very well. They're trained to be the best killers. And so even the notion that we would be using them, not we, they would be using them, to keep the peace, itself one of these kind of Orwellian perversions of language, to overturn somersault of language. And in fact, sort of reading snatches, I was looking today at Reddit of a military thread, and there's a lot of people who are current and former members of the military who don't like this. They don't want to be used as Trump's pawn. And yet, when they sign up for the military, they sign up to take orders. Trump has wanted a display of military might for a long time. He wanted it at his first inauguration. He's talked about using the military. He brought in the National Guard to shoot at Black Lives Matter protesters in Washington in 2020. He has had desire to do this, and he has done it in kind of smaller ways before. The other thing about this is that, and this kind of seems like a small thing considering the whole context, but in general, the way the National Guard are used is the governor. The National Guard are under the authority of the states. There are 50 of them. That is 50 National Guard battalions, or whatever they call them. The governor sees some emergency, calls the president, asks the president to deploy the National Guard, and they do it. It's not done by the president. It's done by the states. And Governor Gavin Newsom has made very, very clear, as has Mayor Karen Bass of Los Angeles, that they had things under control. I mean, the LAPD is not like a wimpy force. It's not like they're not doing their utmost to make sure that nobody does anything they don't like. So this, again, is like a kind of appropriation of the powers of other levels of government, which makes him, again, much more a kind of a singular authoritarian power.
Really helpful reminders. And, I was thinking about earlier, I know earlier, he hasn't been in power that long. It feels like years already, but you think about it, but how he started right away trying to make what many people saw as little changes or inconsequential changes. Not people like yourself who understand the implications, but most people are like, oh, so they don't allow certain books for the military to access, except Mein Kampf. No big deal. Or not really recognizing that the purging of people in high positions, like I'm trying to remember his name, the first Black chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, the highest ranking military officer, because he spoke out against racial oppression after George Floyd was murdered, or the renaming of all these military bases for Confederate leaders who fought against the U.S. military. I mean, and the changing of Navy ship, getting rid of things like Harvey Milk, a ship can't be named that, or I'm trying to remember, Harriet Tubman is another ship, that be just so forbidden. And then appointing Hegseth, I think, speaks volume to the kind of military that they are going for. Those were just things that happened early on that I think now we're seeing in full technicolor kind of what he wants, but those were levers to this. And just, you brought up 2020 and the beautiful uprising for Black lives. And yes, then governors did agree to send the National Guard, unfortunately, but he didn't federalize the National Guard at that point like he did then. And he had people, even though he sent forces of the state against the people, he wanted to do far more violence that he was pulled away from. And now the military is transformed in such a way that I don't know whether people would hold him at bay in the same way. So I think that these are really important differences between this term and last term that people, we just have to continue to recognize. One of the things that shocked, I think, many this week was Trump declaring that protesters were insurrectionists, and Stephen Miller doing the same thing, and many others within the administration. And, then talking about any protest against him
is an insurrection,
including protests on the day of his military parade. He highlighted that. And you've written really powerfully about how fascism grows not just through force, but through spectacle, propaganda, and fear. And I'm wondering, how should we understand Trump labeling peaceful protesters as insurrectionists? And how do you think this language is shaping public perception and laying the groundwork for broader repression? Or perhaps you don't see it that way.
Especially given that he fomented a real insurrection. He tried to overturn a free and fair election, and he sent in his goons to take over the Capitol. That was an insurrection. And yet, when he finally went on television and said, "You're very special, we love you," so that was not an insurrection. And then, of course, when people were sent to prison, he pardoned every single one of them. And in fact, when Leavitt, his propaganda minister, she used the term left wing. She said when left wing protesters. So what he's doing is he's setting up the left as the enemy of the people, the internal enemy, which is also, a classic step of an authoritarian regime, is that you have not only the invaders from the outside, outside, which are the immigrants. You have the danger within. And so, and even when there's not a totally authoritarian regime, such as during the McCarthy period, there were communists, hiding under the bed. And furthermore, the definition of what that kind of enemy is just so elastic. You can sort of label anybody an insurrectionist. I mean, I think this is not the beginning of this kind of state power of surveillance and of kind of naming the enemy within the USA Patriot Act, which was enacted just 2 months after 9/11, gave the state extraordinary power to do unwarranted, searches of people's homes, to gather our phone information, which Edward Snowden later, revealed. And then they took that part out. But by now, like, all of this stuff is just deeply embedded in the law and also in the culture of the way we live under surveillance. I think people, especially of younger generations, have no expectation of privacy. No expectation that the state is going to stay out of their business, which is one of the reasons also that people mistrust the state, and they should. And this is another thing that this sort of instinctual genius that Trump has, which is on one hand to use the state for his own means and at the same time to turn people against the state. What he's turning us against or people against is the benign functions of the state, such as helping people who don't have enough food to eat, that kind of things. And all that's left then is the carceral and surveillance and war-making functions of the state, which, as you suggested, is a very masculine. I mean, Pete Hegseth, a rapist, there's so many rapists in this administration. It's almost as if they should have like a cabinet member, a rapist, the rape department or agency or something. When you were talking in the beginning there about, in the beginning of this question, about the changing of the names of military bases and aircraft carriers and so on, language and symbolism are very, very important. They're a very important part of everything. I mean, not just fascism, they're an important part of our movements too. The images that we use, the words that we use, and the way that language changes, the ways that we have come to talk about, use a different pronoun. Some of your listeners might not remember that in the old days you were either he or she. So these things are not nothing. They're important symbols, which is why people fought to take down monuments of Confederate heroes. I mean, idolatry, this is exactly what idolatry is. It is knocking over idols. The storming of the Bastille in Paris, the earth idolatry. And it happens also, you see that Saddam Hussein's monument was taken down. We won't remember that picture of people like roping the thing off and knocking it down. They did the same thing actually with Melania Trump's monument in her hometown. Somebody took off with it.
Our logo for the podcast is taken from Adele Rodriguez's really powerful painting of the toppling of a Trump monument. The symbolism is so important in what that represents and the message that sends. I wanted to return to this lost of words, the madness that we've seen unleashed on LA, along with the military parade. In case you were living under a rock, they ramped up extremely provocative ICE raids using militarized units across the country over the last few weeks, raiding workplaces and visiting schools, churches, at least one church in LA, literally looking for little kids, arresting parents and laborers, with masked men grabbing people after they dutifully attended court appointments. It's hard to imagine that they didn't want to provoke people to protest, an act that is well within our rights and is completely justified and is the only, I would argue, moral response. These protests have been taken by the Trump regime as license to invade LA, and now they're trying to use this license to invade more blue cities. I'm wondering if you can talk about that in particular, why this is happening now and how we should see it in connection, or should we see it in connection with this fascist military parade?
There's a lot in that question. I think people should look for this video that an onlooker took of a woman just trying to return to her own apartment in LA. And it was surrounded by National Guard, and they ordered her to halt. And she kept saying, "I live here." And they shot her point blank. You see her crying. And the woman who was taking the video ran over to help her. And, these so-called less lethal weapons are not necessarily not lethal. They do kill people, or they blind them, or they disable them, being shot with whatever it is. And, you're describing this massive escalation in the way that ICE is, just sort of taking over cities and just grabbing people off the street. They have these sort of armored vehicles, and they're throwing flashbangs in the street to keep people away from them so that they can keep on going toward their targets. even their quota of 3,000 so-called criminals a day, if you were looking for 3,000 U.S. citizen criminals to round up every day, you would have a very hard time doing so. You would have to just take people who are not criminals. They just want 3,000 bodies, and they'll take any 3,000 bodies. And in fact, they'll take any 3,000 bodies that appear to be immigrants. They don't even need to be immigrants. So it was clearly a provocation, determined and intentional. Trump has been spoiling for a fight, not just with the blue cities, but I would say with cities. Most cities are blue. And the reason that they are is that we live among all kinds of people. It's the very sort of cosmopolitanism and tolerance that cities represent that that MAGA is afraid of and wants to get rid of. I mean, if you're going to have white supremacy, you can't have a city like Los Angeles. Los Angeles is one of those majority-minority cities. There's a minority of white native-born Americans there. I mean, I think it's been moving to see that it's a city that's defending itself. It's defending everybody in it. You don't see like a huge number of Angelenos coming out and counter-protesting. Yeah, take them. Because these are their friends. They're their families. They work with them. They're their fucking gardeners. I mean, try to get your roof fixed without an immigrant. And anybody who does any real work is an immigrant. And furthermore, immigrant laborers are now rebuilding Los Angeles, which practically burned to the ground. People are grateful to them. They're not only defending them, they're grateful. This is a kind of solidarity and a kind of tolerance that is antithetical to the entire kind of emotional and political tone of MAGA.
I think that contrast is so important to remember. I think that you see so much humanity coming forward. I was talking to a friend who, if you care about people and justice, and it is very hard to not feel so full of fear and anger and heartache for what's happening to our immigrant siblings, and the full advance and full fear of is this going to really be a consolidation of fascism? I get that. And at the same time, we've seen so many examples of the huge reservoir of people in this country that do not stand with fascism, that do stand for their immigrant siblings and their trans siblings and really humanity as a whole. And I think that those videos of people running out in their suits to go defend their neighbors, or running out in their pajamas and flip-flops to stop ICE, it gives you so much, or it gives me, I should say, a really important reminder that there is a force that doesn't accept this. And so even as we have to focus on the main thing, that there is a direction that is advancing rapidly, there's also a force that's capable of stopping it. And remembering both at once, I think, is sometimes, at least personally speaking, sometimes difficult.
It is very difficult. The scariest, it's hard to pinpoint which is the scariest aspect of this, but a scary aspect is that it will get to a point, we don't know when that is. First of all, they're going to run out of brown people, and then they're going to come out after white people. They're going to come after, they're already coming. Obviously, they're coming after dissidents because they're shooting at protesters in the street. But it will become more and more difficult for people. In fact, during the attacks on universities, people were losing their jobs. That's not nothing. Simply for even just defending the free speech rights of their students, losing their jobs. A lot of people lost their jobs during the McCarthy period. My father was a school teacher, and he was forced to sign a loyalty oath, which he didn't do. And he had to resign his teaching job. And that causes immense hardship for people. At this moment, it takes a little bit of courage to do this kind of stuff, but it will take more and more courage to do it, which means that we need more and more people around us to defend each other. We need more than the far left. I mean, we need people who just care about democracy, who might not necessarily care very much about immigration one way or the other. Gavin Newsom, this is great for him politically. He wants to run for president. Should we actually have a presidential election in 2028? I don't think he's being cynical. I think he really understands what is going on. Chris Murphy, the senator from New Jersey, I think, or wherever he's from, he has been speaking up at every single turn. Alex Padilla went in to ask a question of Kristi Noem and was attacked and thrown to the ground and handcuffed. I think we need to support these people too. They're moderates. I mean, you don't get elected to be a senator if you're on the far left. We really need everybody. I think like all fascist regimes have had a minority of support, but they have, as we're talking about now, the power to shoot you, imprison you, kidnap you, deport you. The deportation, a lot of people getting deported, they may end up stateless because they can't go back to their own place and they're no longer in the US. So they basically have no passport. You know, Hannah Arendt famously said that you don't have human rights if you don't have a state, if you don't have citizenship. You have to have somebody to defend you as a human. You don't float around in the world as a human with rights. I think we need to gather as many people on our side as we can while we can.
I really agree with that. And I think that what we're seeing, in addition to the righteousness of what Newsom's saying, of what Chris Murphy's saying, of what Senator Padilla was saying, you know, all of these are important. It also shows this fight at the top, that they aren't just going after immigrants, they're going after their political rivals and actually saying, I'm going to arrest you if you defy me, or just outright arresting them. And you have Kristi Noem, head of DHS, saying the National Guard was deployed to quote unquote liberate the city from the city and state government. Like, that speaks volumes to where we're at. And I think that, to your point of, there's a huge section of people who see that this is a departure from the way that this country has normally governed. This is a new level of alarm. I may not, you may not agree with those people on 80% of things, maybe more. But the need to unite with people to stop a regime that imperils humanity and the planet itself, I think, is a note well taken, even as we should feel free to express our disagreements with people about other things. That doesn't mean we shut up and speaking up for our immigrant siblings, our trans siblings, as their humanity is bulldozed. As we close out the conversation, I would love to talk a little bit about morality and what it means to be a moral person in this moment of rising fascism. We've talked about the increased domestic repression. There's also what this country is doing around the world. The streets under Biden were filled with people trying to stop the war in Gaza, but campuses were repressed, and now there's much more silence, even as starving people are literally being shot down as they line up for tiny amounts of food. You have Trump, boasting that he wants to ethnically cleanse Gaza, build luxury hotels there, greenlighting the assault on Iran, which could spiral into enormous war, not to mention taking over Greenland, Panama, Canada. Can you talk about how people of conscience should be acting in this moment, the difference that it would be making if we did act that way?
I grew up in a Jewish communist family, and I learned that it was my responsibility to try to make the world better. And my mother once said, the left is we're like holding on to the back of a train that's barreling down a hill, but we're making it go a little bit slower. In certain ways, it always feels to me like morality is pretty simple. I think the best argument against the genocide in Gaza and against, Israel's apartheid policies is that every human life is equally valuable, period. Every human life here is equally valuable, and those, all these very basic things, compassion, sharing, kindness. And in some ways, to me, this is the most disturbing part of the MAGA movement, is how it mobilizes people's meanness and kind of the worst parts of them. People are generally not mean. I mean, if you meet them at the store or something, but this is, it's really like bringing out hatred and in fact, even affirming hatred as being the moral position, hating transgender people, let's say. Yeah, I mean, I think these very, very basic, do unto others is like, kindergarten morality. But the one thing I feel is that you cannot sit back and just hope that somebody else is going to do it. And you do what you can do. I mean, some people can do civil disobedience and they can go get arrested. Some people have to pick up their kids at daycare. Some people are struggling just to, get by, and they don't have time to do. But everybody has time to do something. I mean, been involved in, housing politics, and the best organized people are the poorest people, the people who live in housing projects. They have really great tenant organizations. These women, they're all women, don't have a lot of time, but they use their time, for their comrades, for their neighbors. Yeah, I think we have a moral obligation to do everything that we can and do what we can. I mean, I don't think people should feel that they have to do more than action that's tolerable for them, or take more risks, even taking a little bit of risk. Show up tomorrow. That would be a good start.
Judith, I want to thank you so much for taking the time to talk with us, to share your expertise, your insights, your perspective. And we're going to link to the show notes to your Substack, and we'll also link to your 2 latest Guardian pieces as well, because there's a lot of richness that we didn't cover fully in there, so people should read it. Is there any other social media platforms or anything else that you want to direct people if they want to connect to more of your work?
There is one piece that I did recently for Boston Review, which is about mutual aid in the time of fascism, mutual aid as resistance, which was nice because the people I wrote about actually got more volunteers and stuff. It actually had a palpable effect, which is not usual for a writer. So yeah, and then you can find other of my writing there too. You can just Google me. I'm not a huge user of social media. Unfortunately, I should be better at it. You reach an age at which you just can't.
I think the best way would be to subscribe to the Substack.
Yes, that would be the best thing. That would be great. Subscribe and pay. It's very cheap. It's cheap.
Be a paid subscriber.
Right. Thank you, Sam. This has been a great conversation, and you're really a wonderful person to talk to, and I really admire your podcast. I've listened to some of it, and it's very useful and important now. So thanks.
Thank you so much.
Take care.
Next, here is Sam's conversation with Elisa von Joden-Forgy of the Lemkin Institute for Genocide Prevention and Human Security. They chat about the genocidal ideology driving the MAGA fascist movement and strategy for taking collective action now.
Today, I am so glad to be speaking to Elisa von, please help me. I don't want to pronounce it wrong.
But you can pronounce it any way you want because it's complicated.
Okay. She is the co-founder and co-executive director of the Lemkin Institute, whose mission is to connect the global grassroots with the tools of genocide prevention. Welcome. Thank you so much for joining me, Elisa.
Thank you so much, Sam. I'm really happy to be here, and it's a huge honor.
I wanted to talk a little bit about something that the Institute wrote several months ago, but continues to be very, very relevant. In fact, perhaps more urgent now than when it was written in March. You wrote a letter to the American people that many people have reached out to the Institute to ask what you do in the face of what appears to be an authoritarian coup. I wanted to ask if you could tell us what prompted you to write this letter. It is a letter that's filled with real guidance on how to both understand and confront what it is we're facing, but also how to respond.
Yeah, that's a great question. So we were getting a lot of emails from people. Clearly, people were looking for answers. My personal story as an academic began with the Holocaust, and that's kind of my moral center is study of the Holocaust, never again, right? I've always thought about what would it have been like had there been a strong genocide prevention protocol in place in the 1920s, say, right? Would it have helped? Wouldn't it have helped? But what we have now has not prevented anything, and in some ways it has helped to mask and shield a lot of states, right, that are complicit in genocide. So, maybe it would have been the same back then. But what we do have at the Lemkin Institute is some historical knowledge of how this genocidal process plays out and what people should look out for and how they can possibly try and keep themselves safe so that they have a better chance of surviving. And in particular, we were concerned with 2 communities. One is the undocumented community, right, which is now as a kind of target of the regime enlarged, not to just undocumented, but people with documents that are somewhat uncertain or citizens. But at that point, it was undocumented people, which clearly were just sort of a lever to get into to begin to chip away at birthright citizenship and the privileges of citizenship, the rights, right, endowed to citizens. So that's one group. And the other is transgender people. This is a regime that is profoundly anti-trans and views trans people as cosmic enemies. And it's a zero-sum battle. You can't can't allow any trans people out there without somehow weakening the state. And so trans people, they're a moral issue, but also a national security issue for these folks in power. We just felt that we had some useful things to say, because the fear in a state like the United States, which is a very compromised democracy, but there is this sense that it's a democracy, because if you listen to the news, one can easily have this fear, is that this is going to be normalized. And what happens with genocide is it creeps up on people. Doesn't look like the Holocaust in retrospect. When Dachau was liberated or Auschwitz was liberated, the world got a sense of how large this process was and the real human cost of it. But until that point, many people just went on living their normal lives, even in Germany. In that awareness, we thought, let's write a letter, let's give people let's number one, support people in their concerns. So they have an institute that's saying these concerns are real. There are real red flags for genocide. Everyone should get prepared. We don't want to scare anyone, but everyone needs to be prepared. And here's what we know. Here are some ideas that we have. So it was really sort of an attempt at solidarity with the American people, particularly those groups who are seen as cosmic enemies and national security threat.
And now we see, with just this week, rounding up tens of thousands of immigrants without any due process is really where we're at in this game. And it shocks the conscience, and yet normal life goes on. And I think that that is one of the things that is like so hard. It's one of those questions that we studied in school. You study all the time. As someone who was raised very religious, was always at synagogue and Hebrew school, and like, how did people go on living their lives knowing that this was happening to their neighbors? Now you see this happening to their neighbor, and it's like, and yet you make your coffee and you go to work, you take your kids to their softball game, and life goes on. And it's like, how do those things coexist?
No, it is shocking. It's hard. It's hard to live like this, isn't it?
Yeah. In your letter, you had wrote something that I think for many people would be provocative in a good way. When you're writing about this authoritarian coup against the U.S. constitutional order, you wrote, quote, driven and overseen by a president and a billionaire, that's Musk, who gave the Nazi salute at the president's inauguration, and deeply infected by the genocidal thinking of many conservatives and evangelical, targeted mainly at immigrants of color and trans people for the time being, end quote. The time being meaning that the targeting is going to expand. And I'm wondering if you could tell us a little bit more about how you see the thinking as genocidal, not just bigoted, not just hate-filled, but genocidal.
That's a really good question. Like, what's the difference? Because we have many different problems here. We have authoritarianism, that's one thing. Not always genocidal. We have hate. Hate brings us closer to genocide, but it's not necessarily genocidal. You're right. People could just be bigots, right? But they don't necessarily need to erase an entire group from, or, a part of that group from the planet. And then we have kind of genocidal ideology, and what are the key features of that? I mentioned earlier one aspect that's really important to keep in mind is kind of this cosmic enemy, this notion of cosmic enemies. These enemies that are enemies not because they've declared war against you, right? Or because they've announced themselves as enemies, or they're like really actually threatening you, right? In some clear way. But they're enemies in a cosmic sense. So, if you're an authoritarian and you have a plan, these people, you have to get them out of the way to achieve your goal. These are cosmic enemies. And for the Nazis, this was Jewish people, also Roma Sinti people. Those were the two major cosmic enemies that had to be dealt with, for whom there was really no room in the Volksgemeinschaft. In the US, it's much more complicated in a sense, because you have a declining white population. So on the one hand, we could say this is white supremacy, but then the number of cosmic enemies is huge. And I actually do think these leaders include in their cosmic enemies not just small minorities, but as we see with the roundup of immigrants, huge numbers of people. And it probably includes all people of color, but it may include other people too, like the labor market redundant. So white people who are considered to be a burden, for example. I think they have a huge image of the different groups that are sort of cosmic enemies, but the ones that they're focusing on, who they really see as enemies in some kind of of essential way. And these people will always be enemies. These are immigrants, particularly undocumented ones, and trans people. And I think that they've said so many things about these groups that are red flags for cosmic enemy thinking, right? That, we can say without a doubt that they would like to erase these people from existence. And I think, one of the signals of that with undocumented people, and I think what has really surprised a lot of people, I know it actually surprised me, is that undocumented people, or people who are being rounded up for whatever reason, because the state claims their documents are somehow not right, or they don't have enough, or they don't have the right ones, or whatever they're saying, the state is saying, they're not being liberated, right? They're not being sent somewhere and then set free, right? In some other country or their home country, right? They're being sent to prison. And in El Salvador, this is a prison where no one has been released except Garcia now, who's now in the US. But as far as we know, or as far as Lemkin Institute has been able to determine, he's the only one. So, they're being sent to permanent prison status. And these prisons are associated with factories. And so they're being sent to permanent enslavement. There's a very weird world emerging out of this. And it's really just not about border control. Border control is when you just don't let people in, or you say, you don't have what it takes to be a citizen, so we're sending you home. This is not refoulement. It's not border control. This is a reworking of power, and it's a reworking of race and space. And there's a class dimension to it as well. That's about enslaving people, depriving them of their liberty. So in a sense, their presence in the United States is being punished with possible lifetime enslavement and death while incarcerated for no crime, no trial. So this is very radical. And that to me has me thinking, this is a kind of enemy that they see these people as an enemy that needs to constantly be patrolled and policed, very much in the same way that Nazis saw communists and then gay people and then Jews, right? And all of these groups that needed to suddenly be incarcerated and controlled, and eventually with Jews annihilated, Jews and Roma Sinti annihilated as totally possible. So we see the beginnings of that kind of thinking. So that's this creation of cosmic enemies. So another aspect of genocidal ideology is like zero-sum thinking. This idea that if one group has any rights, the rest of us have no rights. Like it erases our rights. The radical right, Christian right, has thought in those terms for a long time, and they've really gotten off easy, I think, from the rest of America with their idea that they're two gay people who have a bakery, or if they're gay people want to get married and go to a bakery. These sorts of things erase the rights of Christians, right? So this is really zero-sum thinking. Like we can't share our rights with anybody else. If the people that we see as cosmic enemies have rights, then we have zero rights. So it's zero-sum thinking, and it's in that zero-sum thinking that you have societies declaring war on people within their own societies. That's where you begin to radicalize and recruit members of society to be genocidaires and to agree with the genocidal project. This is how you're getting a lot of Americans to agree with Trump and to vote for him, right? And to support him even now that it's becoming clear that his regime is committing crimes against humanity. So that cosmic enemy is zero-sum thinking. And then just the particular type of hate. This is a regime. I don't know if you've ever read Mein Kampf, right? Like I did for my dissertation. One of the things that shocked me so much about it was that Adolf Hitler tried to be funny. Like he was cracking jokes all the time in Mein Kampf, but they were very mean. They were very dehumanizing. They reveled in cruelty. And we see the same thing in this administration. The use of that kind of humor is very indicative. It's another red flag of genocidal thinking, because every time those jokes are made, it's a rehearsal for actual physical violence. So it's a performance. And so we take at the Lemkin Institute, we just take people at their word. We always say, if you don't want to be called out for genocidal thinking by the Lemkin Institute, don't say things that indicate genocidal thinking. It's really that simple. And so we take these people very seriously. And that's what we're seeing is this cruelty, this humor, zero-sum thinking, and the creation of cosmic enemies.
Thanks for that breakdown. One of the elements in your letter that I really appreciated was the take them at their word point. And now they've been screaming their intentions. Now it's not just taking them at their word, it's taking them at their action, because now they're carrying out their program. Even if you just look at one aspect of it, you look at what we refer to as the linchpin and battering ram of the whole fascist program is the attack on immigrants. You see what they're doing, and it is clearly a program of ethnic cleansing through mass deportations at this point. But I think that it's very important to take them at their word. And I think that your point about what fascists or those who are carrying out or seeking to carry out a genocide, the process that they walk people through in preparation, how people become accustomed to seeing their neighbor, seeing even their family as subhuman and be able to laugh at it in order to later be okay with the carrying out of heinous crimes. Your letter that you written again a few months ago contained a lot of guidance that, as I said earlier, I feel has only heightened in relevance as now, Trump sending troops into LA, rounding up tens of thousands of immigrants without any due process, sending in the Marines, attacking Democratic Party officials, brutalizing protesters. I think it just is more and more relevant what you wrote. And I was wondering if any of the words of wisdom, or I don't know what you call it, advice that you shared, important points of orientation, if you will, that you think are most essential at this moment. What do you wish more people could grasp? And what difference would it make if they did?
Well, one of the things we pointed out in the letter is there is this 3.5% rule that everybody hears about, that you need 3.5% of a population in order to achieve serious change within a society. So you need 3.5% of the population to show up regularly in protest. And this is peaceful protest. We can talk about that later. So that's the idea. And I'm hoping we can get to something like that. But to get people out, the United States is really hampered now because we don't have a political party that is really, truly in opposition. We don't have an opposition party. Like the Nazis had to create Dachau to do something with the Communist Party, which was really an opposition party. We don't have that. So Trump can he's not taking, citizens off the street and sending them to Guantanamo yet, because he doesn't need to do that yet. Because we have, a kind of another party in this two-party system, this inverted totalitarianism that we have lived in for so long, that believes there's going to be elections again and that are still kind of running for their positions in the government. And I think this is short-sighted. I think it's naive. And, maybe they're right, but I doubt it. And, history has shown that probably not. Trump and his merry gang of criminals, as we called them, right, have committed enough crimes now that why would they ever give up power, right? What are they looking at if they do? So I don't think the courts are that strong. I don't think our Constitution, unfortunately, is that strong. I think who is strong in this sort of world is the people. The majority of Americans don't want this. That's been shown again and again. That's clear. And it's important that the whole world sees that, because we'll have to pay for this someday, if things go in the darkest ways that I think they will go. The majority of Americans don't agree with this, but they don't have a party that's organizing them. Like if you look at some of the initiatives, you have Bernie Sanders, right, and AOC, and they are doing a great job, I think, of creating a vision of something else. But apart from them, that doesn't exist. There is no alternative vision being proposed by establishment figures. And the Democrats, I don't know, they're still just asking for money through email, basically. So there's no one helping Americans. There's also no one saying to Americans, we have your back. This is one of the things Trump offered the radical right, was I have your back. I'm going to get you out of jail too, right? What have we seen with LA? The establishment media and most Democratic politicians, okay, they're resisting the use of the National Guard because that's considered unconstitutional. So that's important. Those things are important. If the Democrats really want a well-disciplined resistance, then they need to step up and lead it. Or they have to make room for leaders to emerge that will lead it. And they have to create some kind of strategic alliance with these movements. But the movements themselves should not be co-opted by this two-party system. And they should not be about getting certain people elected or raising raising money for the Democrats. I mean, because we're in serious straits. This is what I want Americans to understand. We're in serious straits. We'll probably not have elections again. These types of states only radicalize. Every little inch that Trump takes is a green light to take more, just like Hitler. Genocidaires always test the waters. They stick their toe in the water. If it's not too cold, then they put their whole foot and then they dive right in. And we are on that process. And there is nothing aside from this kind of rage that many neighborhoods are showing in LA and elsewhere, which is great. And people should be outraged. This is immoral, right? Dark, evil stuff that's happening. But it's going to continue to, just be these sort of pockets of sudden resistance unless we can discipline a movement and come together across all of our differences. And that is incredibly difficult because we have a neoliberal system, that has co-opted all resistance into NGO systems that were in many ways funded by the Democratic Party or by Democratic Party funders. And it has created identities that are constantly at odds with one another, right? So we have to do some heavy lifting as a people. But if there are middle-class white folks out there who are thinking, this is horrible and I'm so against it and it's really sad, but, at least my children will be safe. That's not true. It's 100% not true. And I would love to suggest that everybody read a book called Diary of a Man in Despair by a man named Friedrich Reck, who was an ultra-conservative German who hated the Nazis, lived through Nazism, kept a diary that he had to keep hidden. I mean, he hated them for so many reasons, but he was a conservative nationalist. So the type of people who really helped them gain power. And you know where he died? As an old man, he died in Dachau. Why? Because at the end of the war, when the Nazis were losing, they were calling up all men, whether they were 12 years old, little boys, or 80-year-old men, to serve in these kind of like last-ditch military formations to defend the homeland or something. And he had just had a heart attack and couldn't walk. And so he didn't show up for training. And that was it. And he was taken to Dachau, and that's where he died. So everybody will be eaten alive by this state at some point if we let it continue in the direction it's going in. So that's really what I want people to understand. And in our letter, we stated that we believe that we're still in phase A, plan A. And that is when there is still time to push back. Maybe enough to affect a kind of regime change, or maybe just enough to moderate this regime, right? Although it's not about reform, it's about scaring them. They have to be afraid of pushback. That's where we are. But if, for example, this government gets rid of birthright citizens, or this government is allowed to declare martial law in response to protest, right? Trump's toying with that right now, right? He's toying with invoking various laws, right, or acts that would allow him to rule without the Constitution, even against citizens. If that happens, so if we have a false flag, if we have, more sort of strong resistance, or if birthright citizenship is erased, right, or thrown away, then, we have that kind of radicalizing moment when we're in Plan B. And Plan B involves going into hiding, more secretive forms of resistance, and then getting people out who are really, really vulnerable to being murdered by the regime. And one thing I want to add here is that the trans community is so vulnerable right now because trans people, and this is very similar to the way that Nazis dealt with gay people, but trans people, their lives as trans people can be erased without killing their body. And this is the thing. So the state can get away with destroying a whole identity group and say, look, well, but they're still walking around. That's simply by not allowing them to exist as their actual gender, right? And their chosen pronouns and their reality, and depriving them of gender appropriate care, medical care, and by slowly restricting all of their possibilities of showing up in public as themselves. This is one group of people that I'm hoping parties outside the United States, third countries or second countries, countries outside of the United States will focus on and will help liberate from the United States if we begin to descend and radicalize into a genocidal dictator.
And I think that the point that you were making about the window is narrowing by the day, these are my words, not yours, but the window is narrowing by the day, but the window is not yet shut. Because we can have this conversation still as one indicator of it. And as long as that window is open, I believe we have to be pushing with all we can to do, as you were saying, to bring all of those, the vast majority who do not want this genocidal future, this nightmare, to stop it. And I think that it's so foreign to us, that notion. Well, we wouldn't do that. We couldn't do that. Well, in the same way that people also believe that it couldn't get that bad, it couldn't be there. So on both ends, I think people are mistaken. Just think about things that have happened in American history. The unthinkable, the genocide, the enslavement, the internment, things that are unspeakable. Those have happened, but so too have been, the freedom rides, the civil rights movement, like at each of those points, there have been not what we're talking about in terms of millions and millions in the streets, but planting their bodies on the line and saying, we're not going to stop until this regime does. But the same ingredients were there. People that saw the way that things were going and saying, not on my watch, and doing some things. I think that is such an important point. And it's tricky, right? Because we need millions and millions. And those millions are going to have different visions of that better world and yet have to come together because none of those visions will be possible as long as this regime is in power. So I think that that's the tricky part, but I think it's also a beautiful thing for people to talk about the world that we should be envisioning and that we should be fighting for politically. And that I think is important work. I mean, when I think about what it would mean for, movements to shift from defensive positioning to offensive positioning, I also think of the fact that we're constantly fighting rearguard, like we're constantly working on shrinking ground. And righteous as it is to stop these workplace raids, they're going to continue to bulldoze any effort to block them. They're going to go bigger, and they have the ability to. As important as it is for people to stand up to and defy and say, National Guard, go away, like they're going to continue to send more National Guard as long as they're in power. So it's like, as important as it is to stand up for the basic rights of our trans siblings, as long as this regime is in power, they're going to shred those rights. If the more we can move people to see, we need to continue standing up for our siblings, absolutely. And the biggest way that we can do that is remove this regime from power as soon as possible, because as long as they're in the grounds that we're working on, it's going to shrink until we have nothing left. And then it does become phase B. And then we do have to do something different. But as long as we're in this zone, what can we do? And I guess I do need to talk about this weekend. This is a week where we've talked about there's been mass sweeps, terror against immigrants. There's been the National Guard and Marines occupying U.S. streets to crush righteous, overwhelmingly nonviolent protests. You have Trump threatening to arrest Newsom and Bass, the mayor of LA. I think that people are beginning to confront what that will mean if they're able to do this. No rights, no dissent, no due process. Really, now we're in the zone of brute terroristic dictatorship. And on top of all of that, this weekend, Trump is staging a military parade on his birthday. And, many are framing it still as a ego trip or some kind of just waste of money or whatever. And I guess I would like your take on what this represents and what you think the connections between these different events, the military parade, the Guard in LA, and these raids. How should we see these connected? Should we see them connected? I guess those are two separate questions, so you can take one of them and leave the other.
Oh, I see it as one question, actually. So hold on, tell me if I'm missing something, right? But I see it as one question. And I think, what we're seeing is sort of what you said. It's like a transfer of the United States from a constitutional republic to a militarized totalitarian dictatorship defined by the party and the figurehead, like the Führer. That's what we see. I think this is a very strategic regime. I do think Trump is vain. There's a lot going on all at once. But this was mapped out in Project 2025. He has a lot of super strategic, really cynical advisors who have helped him, not make the mistakes of his first presidency, which I think in his mind is probably that he gave the Constitution 2 looks rather than one, right? I mean, that he showed any respect for it at all. I think Steve Bannon, Stephen Miller, these really really alt-right, radical Nazi types in the regime. And then the Heritage Foundation and the Project 2025 people that they brought on, these folks know what they're doing. And I'm sure this is all somehow coordinated. And it's about shifting allegiances in the United States from the Constitution to the party, from the Constitution to the man. I mean, we came into this regime knowing, and unfortunately, there were not any efforts to dismantle this level of power, but knowing that CBP and ICE were really a presidential guard, right? If you want to look at it that way. These are people who, in the first Trump regime, created a network of terror. I mean, we can't forget they separated families. Some of the children from that separation, which is a genocidal act, it falls under 2E of the Genocide Convention, paragraph 2E, and the harm it caused is very much akin to genocidal harm. They haven't been reunited with their families that they were separated from. So we're still living in that. And these are the masterminds of that. So CBP and ICE have always been a kind of presidential guard for the radical right. And there's nothing they won't do. I had a friend who was picked up by ICE here in Philadelphia and who was involved in trying to get her out, which took years. And she was eventually released and her legal status was clarified. But this effort I was involved in involved a lot of meetings with ICE. And there was no doubt in my mind that these were human beings without any moral compass. These were completely desensitized people. So they have been a very radical element in our republic, really since the first Trump administration, and there hasn't been enough done to dismantle them. So here they are. They're super powerful now. They're deputizing apparently all sorts of people to help them with this. But Trump has to worry about the military, he has to worry about the police. So what he's trying to do is shift allegiances, is bring those groups, the National Guard, the military, and the police, under his wing. He has sizable numbers of people already, but there's enough dissent within those groups, enough pushback, that I think he's making an effort to ensure their loyalty. And, this is part of this larger process that has to do with dismantling birthright citizenship, so that citizenship is no longer a right. It's a privilege that's bestowed upon us by a state that sees us as useful and in line with their goals. So any of us can lose our citizenship and therefore be disposed of in El Salvador or wherever else, Guantanamo, and those who are willing to be foot soldiers for whatever other plans this regime has, will be allowed to continue as citizens, although they too will not have independent right from the gaze of the state. So I think that's what's happening, is this is just a transfer of loyalties away from the Constitution and towards the president. And it's very, very, very dangerous.
Well, I want to thank you so much, Elisa, for joining me and sharing your expertise, your perspective, your insights, and of course, your time. Listeners can visit the LemkinInstitute.com, Lemkin Institute, not the in front of it, and it will be linked in the show notes. Any other places that you want to direct listeners to read more, learn more, connect with your work?
No, thank you. It's just all up there on the Lemkin Institute website. Thank you very much.
Well, I'm so glad that we were able to do this.
Me too. This has been a lovely conversation, Sam, and I've learned a lot through it. So thank you so much.
Thanks for listening to Refuse-Fascism. Mark your calendars and start making plans to be in D.C. July 4th for 4 days of resistance starting July 1st. In the name of humanity, we declare our independence from Trump's fascist America. On July 4th, join in the biggest chant ever. Trump must go now. Find out more at refusefascism.org and sign up. Want to support the show? Thank you. Spread the imperative and support the show by getting merch. Join our Patreon community to fuel refusal of this fascist nightmare at patreon.com/refusefascism. Share this show with others, rate and review on Apple Podcasts, wherever you listen, or comment on socials or YouTube. It does make a difference, and it's so appreciated. Connect with us on social media at Refuse-Fascism, including on Blue Sky, and you can also find us on TikTok at Refuse-Fascism spelled funky. Just check the show notes to see how that's spelled. It's with a Z. As always, thanks to Richie Marini and Mark Tinkelman for helping to produce the show. Until next Sunday, in the name of humanity, we refuse to accept a fascist America.